All right. Can someone please acknowledge in the chat that you can hear me? The settings on this machine are a little goofy, so if you could just type in the chat whether you hear me or not, I'd appreciate it. Okay, good. All right, today we're going to get into more into JavaScript, and we're going to look at sort of the recipe for the way most of our JavaScript is going to start. And we're going to do that by looking at a very simple example. And then later on, by later on, I mean later on in the lecture, we can talk about how this relates to Lab 2. All right. I'm going to start out by showing you the web page, and then we will look at exactly how this is accomplished. So I have a page that has presumably Star Wars spoilers on it. I have some buttons to either show the spoiler or hide the spoiler. So Luke Skywalker's dad is, if I click show spoiler, it says Yoda. If I hide the spoiler, it makes it disappear. We're going to look at this example first because I sort of built this in steps. This is the simplest case of accomplishing JavaScript, and then I sort of improved it a little bit for the Baby Yoda example. So notice what happens. We have our web page. All right. When we click show spoiler, that web page changes. That's exactly what I mean by interactivity. And JavaScript is big for creating interactivity for a page that has already been loaded. Notice, for example, that we don't see anything down here in the status area. When we view this page and click on the show or hide spoiler, it's not like when we reload the page where we can see a little flicker. Although this shows up, this doesn't show up real well either because, you know, this is a local file on my machine, and therefore the execution is extremely quick. So I have a show spoiler, hide spoiler. Page is loaded. I click on this. That's the user action. The response is that the page changes in some way. In this case, it changes by showing the spoiler. Likewise, it shows when we hide the spoiler. Okay, so let's look at the code that does this, and let's look at how HTML, CSS, and JavaScript together make something like this works. All right, if we look at the code, the HTML code for this, we'll notice a few things, and we're going to start out ignoring this script tag. That's for the Yoda example. So we're going to not worry about this Baby Yoda thing, and we're not going to worry about this script thing right now. All right. Let's just look on the Luke Skywalker one. What I have is I have content in HTML. Both the content that is visible and the content that is initially invisible is in HTML. In other words, the paragraph that I display all the time is there, and the paragraph that I am showing and hiding is there. All right. Now, is given an ID of spoiler1 and a class of spoiler. If you remember back from CISS232, a class can be on many HTML elements, whereas an ID should only point to one HTML element per page. So there should be nothing on this page that has an ID of spoiler1. However, there may be other things on the page that have a class of spoiler. Okay. Now, if we notice in our CSS, we have it designated that anything with a class of spoiler, the display is none, which means basically that it's invisible. All right. So when we go back to when the page initially loads, we see our paragraph here. That's the plain old paragraph, no style on it. There actually is sort of a paragraph here, right? But there's no display for it. So it's there, it's in the source code, but there's no display for it. Therefore, we can't see it. So that's how the HTML and CSS relate to the initial setup of the page. So if we look at the code, we're going to see how the page looks like when it originally loads. If we look at the HTML and the CSS. The JavaScript is what happens when we start having interactions with the page. And we have a button here that has an on-click method or on-click attribute of this. Now, this is quite a long instruction, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time breaking it down for you. Let's actually copy this into Word. Copy this into Word. Oh, and it copied. With the formatting. Okay. Maybe this wasn't the best idea. There we go. That's what I wanted. We get rid of that blue line. There we go. All right. This is part of the button tag. It is an attribute of the button tag. And it says onClick equals, then we have a long JavaScript statement that's included in double quotes. So this double quote starts a JavaScript statement, this quote ends a JavaScript statement. OnClick is what is called an event. An event is something that happens on the page, oftentimes triggered by a user action. So in this case, the user clicks on the button. There's other user events, so other than clicking. The user can put their mouse on something on the page. The user can press a key. The user can, what else can a user do? Double click on something. The user can right mouse on things, and so on. These are all events. And if we look and search for HTML events, we'll see a list of these things. I have, here's a list of some of the common ones. On change means that you've changed something in the HTML. Specifically, we've entered data into a form field. If I put my name in a text box as Mike and then I change it to Michael and I tab out of it, this event will fire off. On click, of course, means to click on the element. On mouse over puts your mouse in the element. On mouse out is when you take your mouse out. On key down, on load. That's some of the most common ones. On load is often used to sort of set up the page because it's used when the page finishes loading. So if there's some initialization that needs to take place in JavaScript, it will be put on the onload event of the page. And we have a complete list over here. We're not going to use all these. We're probably going to restrict ourselves to the main ones that we have defined here. And this is a great page that you can review on W3 Schools. All right, look for JavaScript events. So that's what this part means. Means the event that we're going to code something for is on click. Does that mean on click anywhere? No, it means on click on the specific HTML element that the on click event is written for. So if I view this page and I click over here or on this, nothing happens. We have to click on the button for that event to be triggered. Why? Because that code is written for the button. Button on click. That's an attribute of the button tag. Now, this is probably the most simple way to associate JavaScript code with an event. We're going to learn a different way to do that. It might be today. It might be some other day. I'm not sure. We'll just have to see how today's lecture goes. We then have an equal sign, right? Because all HTML attributes have the double quotes. All right. So I hope you understand that basic form. Event equals, and then double quotes, and inside that quotes is some JavaScript. All right, I'm going to remove everything but the JavaScript because I think that the first part of it is pretty simple. I removed too much of it. All right. This is a JavaScript assignment statement. Here is the left-hand side of the equal sign. Here is the right side of the equal sign. This statement is a real important statement, so we're going to break it down to make sure we understand exactly what that means. All right, we'll break it down one step at a time. Document means look for something on this web page. So document basically means this web page. So I'm interested in making a change somewhere on this web page. I'm interested in doing something somewhere to this web page. That's what document means. Get element by ID means find the thing on the page with this ID. In our case, the ID is spoiler 1. So this is going to find the thing on the page that has an ID of spoiler 1. All right. Is there something on the page that has an ID of spoiler 1? You betcha there is. This paragraph here, the first paragraph is or the first spoiler rather has a ID of spoiler 1. So we're going to do something to that paragraph. Dot style means do something to the style for that element. Dot display means do something to the display style attribute. Now, here's a key point. This display attribute is the exact same attribute that we set in CSS. Right here, we have it set to display of none. And that's valid when the page initially loads. And the style for spoiler, anything with a class of spoiler, is to set the display value for none. So when the page initially loads, spoiler 1, the display attribute for it is none. Well, in this instruction, we're saying we want to change that. All right. What do we want to change it to? Well, we have our equal sign means assign a value. And what value do we want to say? We want to say change the value of that attribute to block. Value we want to set the display attribute to. So when we do this and when we click on this and this instruction fires off, it's going to find the thing on the page as an element of spoiler 1. It's going to change its display attribute in its style to block. Which will cause it to a value back to none. So it restores it to its original state of none. Keep losing sound. Are you losing it completely, or is it just fading in and fading out? Oh, it goes blank. That could be either my or your web connection, would be my guess. If there's something specifically you want to ask me to repeat, please put it in the chat. If it becomes too much to where you can't understand it, oh, just flashed up on the screen. We're having problems related to the network. All right. Well, if you run into problems and there's something you don't understand, please ask me to repeat. So is there anything you want me to repeat now? Okay. Thank you for letting me know that. If the problem is my end, unfortunately, it's going to affect the recording too. So hopefully these the problems will go away quickly. All right. Are there any questions about how I can make this paragraph appear and disappear using this JavaScript associated with these two buttons. Any questions? All right. Well, what I'm going to do now is we're going to talk about what can go wrong, right? And how to find out what's wrong and how to fix it. So I'm going to make an error here. I'm going to do what I did when I was first playing with this. I got the name of the ID wrong. Let's say I type in spoiler 1 instead of spoiler numeral 1. And I save that. And I try to do it. I click show spoiler and nothing happens. Well, this could be very frustrating, right? Because how do you know what's wrong? I mean, we know what's wrong in this case, right? Because I deliberately messed it up. But if you didn't deliberately mess it up, how are you going to figure out what's wrong? Well, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to look for the JavaScript console. And if you're using Google Chrome, I'll show you where the JavaScript console is. If we're using another browser, I'll look at maybe a couple other browsers and show you where the JavaScript console is there. If you're using Google Chrome, click these three dots here, click on More Tools, and click on Developer Tools. And if it doesn't come up to Console, click on the Console tab. Now, this gives us an error that's pretty cryptic. Let's look at that error. Uncaught type error, cannot read properties of null, reading style. Add HTML button element, click on line 24, characters 121. And if we were to count everything out, that would be on this line. And I would imagine this is 121, maybe? I don't know, but it tells you the location. Now, there's a few things to understand. First of all, this is a machine that is evaluating your code. Therefore, it speaks in very literal machine-like commands. The problem, as we can see, is obvious, right? There is nothing called spoiler 1 on this page with the word 1 written out, right? What it's actually telling you is when it goes to look at the style of the thing called spoiler 1, it's null. And null means, yeah, we can do that as well. And null means that there's no value for it. So there's no value for it means that, hey, this spoiler 1 is invalid, and therefore it has no style. Now, you mentioned to click inspect. One thing we can do is we can click any element and click inspect, and we can see details of the code. Was that what you wanted me to show, or what did we want to look at? This can be useful in debugging as well. First thing I usually do is look at the console. So if it tells you that it's null, it means it doesn't exist. So what doesn't exist? Well, in this case, it's telling me there's no style attribute of this thing, and therefore, effectively, that's telling us, hey, this ID doesn't exist. Now, we might get this error also if we did something like this. I typed in style with a capital S. Because remember, JavaScript is case sensitive. So if we were to view this page, and click here, it gives us a similar error. Cannot set properties of undefined. The wording is a little bit different, but it's telling you essentially the same thing. That, hey, this style doesn't exist. There is no display for a thing called style. Well, what do you mean there's no display for a thing called style? We saw me do it in class. Well, that's because style was with the lowercase s. So it essentially doesn't know what that means. And therefore we have to change it to lowercase style. Of course, there could be other problems as well. If you forgot the double quote or the ending of the single quote, it's going to get really confused as well and give you a different error. Oh, and it even tells us that I'm missing a parenthesis. And again, I'm not really missing the parenthesis because the parentheses there, I'm missing the quote. Therefore, it doesn't recognize this parenthesis going along with this parenthesis. Now, one thing that's a little tricky about doing it this way is notice the use of the two different kinds of quotes. I'm using double quotes and single quotes in this example. The double quotes go around the complete JavaScript statement. So it starts at the beginning of the JavaScript statement, it ends here. I'm using single quotes to indicate values inside the JavaScript statement. If I were to put a double quote here, besides the errors that it gives us in Visual Studio Code, is going to give us an error because it really doesn't see that as a completed JavaScript statement. It thinks the JavaScript statement ends here because we need to use the single quotes inside of the double quotes to differentiate between the meaning of the two different kinds of quotes. All right. So far, so good. Now, one of the key things, key rules of thumb programming is, make this even bigger, DRY. Does that mean keep your keyboard dry? Well, maybe, but it also means do not repeat yourself. So this code worked all well and good when we only had one spoiler on this page. But if you could imagine a page that had a dozen of these, all right? We'd have to copy and duplicate this, copy and paste this long instruction a dozen times. And even worse, what if there was another JavaScript function here? Because there could be. I could, for example, change the make it visible, and I could change color the text to blue. All right. That should be right. Let's run this and see. Changed it to blue. Now I could have just done that with the CSS because if it's invisible, it doesn't matter what color it is. All right, but bear with me. All right, I just wanted to demonstrate I could do a second JavaScript command there. And I could do a third, a fourth, a fifth command. So this on-click event could actually have a bunch of stuff in it. All right, could have a bunch of stuff in it. And I'd have to copy all that stuff for the 10 different spoilers I had. All right. It's much better instead if I put those statements together, group them together in what is called a function. And then I only have to put a small statement to call that function on the event itself. All right. So let's look at this second example. Second example behaves the same as the first. But as you notice, I don't have the same thing in here. I have onClick equals show spoiler, and then in parentheses, spoiler 2. In parentheses and in single quotes, spoiler 2. Now, show spoiler and hide spoiler are not JavaScript commands. They're a function that I have created. Right? They're a function that I have created. And you might know from other programming classes that a function is where you are going to reuse code. So you take a block of code, could be one statement, could be a half dozen statements if you want. Could be more than that even. You take that code and you put it in a function, you give the function a name, and then when you want to call the function, all you do is put the function name and supply any necessary arguments. Arguments are the things that you want the function to act upon. For example, if in Excel, you put in square root of 144. You'd put equals SQRT, parentheses, 144, and parentheses. The 144 is the argument to that function. I want to do the square root, but what do I want to do the square root on? Well, I want to do it on the value of 144. Right? Or I could say equals square root cell B15. All right. Well, B15 is the argument then because it knows to pull the value from cell B15, and that's what you want to do the square root of. All right. So arguments are what we want to do. So which spoiler do we want to show? We want to show spoiler 2. Okay. I have also a function for hide spoiler. And that hide spoiler function does the opposite. It still takes the argument of what we want to hide, but it changes it to call the hide spoiler function and hides instead. Let's look at what these functions look like. First of all, these functions exist in a script tag. They start off with the word function. It has these braces or curly brackets to indicate the start and the end of the function. After the function name, there's a list of arguments. In other words, what do you need to supply this function to make it work? Well, in the case of show spoiler, I have to supply the ID of the spoiler that I want to show, or in the other function, hide. All right, so when I call this function and give it a value of spoiler 1, that gets put in this variable ID spoiler. All right. And I simply say, very similar to the other instruction, document get element by ID, but instead of putting the hard coding the ID of what I want to show or hide, I say use the value of that argument. And because this is the value of a variable, I don't need to enclose it in quotes. So I'm saying is whatever I call this function with, put this value in ID spoiler, and we're going to show that code. So therefore, if I'm adding functions, if I'm adding spoilers to this, it's pretty straightforward because all I have to do is keep that naming convention, and this is a much more straightforward way of doing things. Let's also change the color of the text to blue. So I can have as many functions as I want to, and I can have anything that you can do in other programming languages here, like if statements, loops, and so on. I'm not an expert on Star Wars, so I'm going to try to make up another spoiler. Who shot first? Han shot first. Change this to spoiler 3. Change this to spoiler 3. This is spoiler 3. And I'm in business, and everything should work the way I want it to. Much easier to maintain this page. If you have two ways of doing something in a program, and one way is easier for you to come back and maintain later, that's almost always the better way to do it. Because one sure thing about your programs, and this applies to programs of any language, whether you're talking about web and JavaScript or something else, is that you're going to need at some point to change the page. Therefore, whatever strategy you take to change the page, if it makes the changing easier, is a better solution than if it's harder to change. So in this case, we saw that having this one little function in here that I call is much easier than having that big couple of lines of code that I had to duplicate. So it's easier to maintain, makes it easier. I do less things. All I'd have to do in this case is copy this, paste it, and I have another spoiler as long as I change the IDs here, here, and here. So there's like 4 little steps that I have to do to make sure that I can add a new spoiler here. Now, if we could discover a way that was even less steps, well, that would be a better way still. All right. So in this course, it's not only about getting the right answer. It's about getting the right answer and coding it in a way that makes your code easy to understand and easy to maintain. I'm going to add another button here. It's going to toggle. In other words, if the spoiler is visible, it's going to make it invisible. If the spoiler is invisible, it's going to make it visible. So it's just going to change the value for that. See how much time we have, 10 minutes. Let's see how much damage we can do in 10 minutes. I'm going to create a new function. All right. What? Okay. All right, and it popped up network problems again. So what is it going to do? It's going to sometimes set it to block, sometimes set it to none. When is it going to set it to block? It's going to set it to block if I'm writing a JavaScript if statement. If the style equals none, then I want to change it to block. Use the double quotes for comparisons in JavaScript, or the double equal sign rather. Let's examine what this statement does now. All right. I'm going to set it to none. So if it's displaying, we're going to set it to none. And I have my button here to toggle the spoiler. If I go and save this, fresh, click on that, and nothing happens. Well, I'm going to pretend I did that on purpose to help you learn more about debugging. So I click on my console. I don't get any errors. Oh, there it goes. What was wrong? First time it doesn't work. Interesting. I think I know what's going on. I believe I can fix it by doing this. I might look to see if I can figure out a better solution of this. Oh, okay. I think I know how to do it. Say not equal to. There we go. And now that doesn't work. No, okay, that's wrong. If it's not equal to none, this should be flipped. Not equal to none, make it none. Otherwise, make it black. I'll tell you what, I'm going to leave this with this little problem in it, and I'll post a fix to this as soon as I have it. I'm sure it's pretty straightforward. Equal to none, make it black. There's no style for it. It goes. Because actually that ID doesn't have a style associated with it. All right. So therefore, if there's no style associated with it, it has to do, it has the original style of none. This two single lines, like vertical lines like this, is an or. So if there's no display, or if the display is none, or there's no display attribute at all, then it's hidden and display it. All right, I'm going to give you a challenge for next time, and I'm going to talk about your assignment that's due week 3. All right. If you make it so that we change the value of this button, instead of toggle spoiler, to show spoiler if it's invisible, to say hide spoiler if it's visible. So in other words, not just toggle the visibility, but change the value of this button. Change the name of this button from, if it's invisible, it should say show spoiler. If it's visible, it should say hide spoiler. See if you can figure out how to do that. Now, as far as your first assignment goes, to create tabs. What are tabs going to require? They're going to require HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. The HTML is going to be the different sections of your page, your JavaScript section, your JavaScript section, your PHP section, and your Ajax section. That's going to be the content that you're going to have, all on one page. You're going to use CSS to stack those things on top of each other and make all but one of them invisible. And then you're going to have links on the top that when you click on them, it shows or hides the appropriate section of the page. The more you can make those look like tabs, the better off you're going to be. I do apologize for the sound issues. I hope they didn't totally destroy the lecture for you. Let me know if you have any questions. Do you have any questions now? Let me. So the variable spoiler within the function gets defined somewhere before using it in the function. I'm not really sure what you mean. Do you mean this variable here, ID spoiler? I'll tell you what, I have to clear out a lab. Let me go into the lab and we can discuss this in this room in about 5 minutes. So if you want to wait, Laura, for 5 minutes or so and, you know, to ask the question that way, we can do it. Maybe you can even use your microphone if you want to. It might be easier to talk that way. So I'll be on in 5 minutes to answer your question in this room. All right. Well, thank you. We'll see you next week.
You guys can come in.
Come in? Yeah. Okay, thank you.